Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Tim. And I should also thank Paul Wovelis, he and his team are doing a wonderful job making a video of this so it can be put on YouTube so that we can terrorize Mr. Shorten. So it is the 18th National Conference. We're very proud of the fact that we've had a national conference every year since the referendum. No Republican organisation has done that, and it is wonderful to be here with the Monarchist League in Australia. Now, the morning programme is I'm going to talk on the operational structure in 1999, because I think there are valuable lessons which we can learn from that. Then we're going to, subject to Wing Commander Nick Hobson arriving because he's caught up in the problems in Sydney, we'll be looking at digital plans, the way we will modernise that 1999 structure. That may be delayed a little until Nick arrives. George Burgess was going to say a few words about the constitutional monarchy across the world. And then we'll have the Neville Bonner oration, and Brian Sturton-Gill will tell us how it all began, because the reaction, the defence, began with the Monarchist League in Australia, the Victorian chapter, before Australia as a constitutional monarchy was established in Sydney. The theme is, as you know, once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more. And that's appropriate, isn't it? Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead. The game's afoot, follow your spirit, and upon this charge cry God for Harry, England, and St. George. Amen. Isn't that a wonderful theme for us? And of course, that's the reason why we have this theme. Not that we're being political. Mr. Turnbull is also a Republican, but Mr. Shorten has made an announcement. And I was looking at the current national platform of the ALP. It's extraordinary, you know, the greatest leaders of the ALP, the greatest Labour leaders in this country, were all solid constitutional monarchists. John Curtin, Ben Chifley. Dr. Evatt wrote a book, The King and His Dominion Governors. Go back to right back to the beginning of the Labour Party, they were all constitutional monarchists. Anyway, they say there will be a constitutional convention. Mr. Shorten hasn't mentioned that. He's going to have a plebiscite. Notice the plebiscite will be to gauge support for an Australian head of state. We've always argued that the Governor-General is the head of state, as does the government, because whenever they send the Governor-General overseas, he goes as the head of state. It is going to be not a plebiscite, or not a real plebiscite. It's not going to be a referendum. It's going to be what I would call, following Mr. Trump, a fake referendum. And I'll come back to this later, but they do have some advantage in using the word head of state. That's why they use it. In fact, in the Yes-No booklet in 1999, they used it 9 times, because they know that this is the only argument they can possibly make. Then apparently a second plebiscite on the model. Isn't it strange? They're talking about this major constitutional change without knowing what the change will be. And then a referendum to formally adopt a change. Now, Mr. Shorten was objecting to the same-sex marriage plebiscite on the grounds of cost. But I can see here 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 major votes where the people have to vote before we become this republic. And also, in the platform, there will be a member of the federal executive, the government, in the formation of a Labour government, who'll be the minister for the republic. He or she will have executive responsibility to push it, to drive it. So they are trying to be serious about this, just at a time when support has declined significantly. Well, the battle plan. I think we have 5 Ps, which are the themes. Firstly, the people. a strong support base, people like you. Principles. We have to have beliefs. All of these have to be based on intellectual argument why we wish to remain a constitutional monarchy. To find another P, preaching and the latest communication ability. Preaching, presenting the cause to the people. And when we come to discuss the digital program, then we will be looking at how to modernize that. And the next P is polling and research. Fortunately, a lot of this is done for us. A lot of the polling is done for us. It is interpreting it correctly, making it very public. And finally, the fifth P is a power centre. We ran the campaign in 1999 as a sort of military operation. I can say that with some experience because I was a national serviceman at Ingleburn and Maitland, and I must say they've never been invaded since then. So I obviously was a very successful national serviceman, but you've got to run it as a military campaign. It's got to be tightly run. It has to involve a great consensus, but you do have to have a sort of high command, as the Americans have, a central command. That is so crucial. So the 5 Ps. Let's assess how the Republicans went. There he is. Let's assess how the Republicans went in 1999 on the 5 Ps. 2 interesting questions. We called on you to be the foot soldiers. 50,000 people across the country agreed to help. They turned up at polling booths, they handed out information and so on. The ARM had to ask the ALP and the ACTU to man the polling stations because they didn't have the people themselves. They had a number of elite celebrities. They went to candlelit dinners, but they didn't have the rank and file. And just before the referendum, they held a big rally in the centre, the geographical centre of Sydney, that is Parramatta, at lunchtime on a Friday. This was just before the referendum. They had music and they had celebrities. And the media announced it constantly, especially the Daily Telegraph. The Daily Telegraph announced it every day. But when it was actually held, what happened? There weren't hundreds of thousands, there weren't thousands, tens of thousands. There weren't even hundreds of people. The turnout was so embarrassing, the media, mainly on the Republican side, just did not report it. So they do have a serious problem. They don't have a strong support base when it comes to the first P, people. Principles, their arguments are not intellectual. They just say, I'm a Republican. Yes, emotional, they hate the Queen, they hate the royal family, but they have no intellectual argument for change. Part of this is because they have no program to improve the governance of Australia with their republic. Preaching and communications ability, they had advantages, particularly in the early period. They had the media almost totally on side. There are only a few talkback commentators who were on our side. The Australian had 2 or 3 people writing occasionally, Christopher Pearson, Tony Abbott. Occasionally they let me write something. But most of the media was very Republican. Fortunately, they couldn't avoid us. Why? Because the media loves conflict. So although they misrepresented us, they still had to report us. So we had that advantage. So don't worry too much about having a media that doesn't care for you. You can still get through, as President Trump did. He had most of the media against him, but he was in the media every day, didn't spend that much money on advertising, and then he became president. Polling and research, well, you rely on the polling that is available, the research that is available. You interpret it well, and that helps you very much. And we had the power centre. But they didn't have a power centre. During the referendum, the Yes Committee, I am told reliably, met on one occasion It was full of celebrities. They fell out with one another. Malcolm Turnbull didn't call another meeting. There was a lot of confusion in the campaign. What do they have? They have the politicians. 2/3 of the politicians. That doesn't mean a third were on our side. Only a handful were on our side. Most of the others just pulled their heads below the parapet. So they had most of the politicians, they had the media, and they had an enormous amount of money. The money strangely dried up during the campaign. They must have known that they weren't going to do any good. And Malcolm Turnbull had to put in his own money. That's what Greg Barnes revealed in his book. He was his deputy. Just as in the 2016 election in New South Wales, Malcolm Turnbull had to fund the Liberal Party in New South Wales. I'm just going to go over some highlights of the campaign. Because I wanted to demonstrate to you, although the Republicans with their people say they have passion, and monarchists rarely describe themselves as passionate, the strength was on our side. That's Government House in Sydney. In 1996, Bob Carr decided to throw the governor out of Government House and, as he put it, return it to the people. This was the purpose-built home for the governor. He wanted to take it over for the government of the day. This was enormously unpopular. And ACM, it was Lloyd Waddy and Kerry Jones, they arranged a demonstration, the most peaceful demonstration. There has never been a Republican demonstration like this. They brought out 20,000 people from all over New South Wales and other states in Macquarie Street, Sydney. As far as you could see, there were people. The media tried to play that down. So, for example, the ABC said there were 10,000 there. You don't get 10,000 people, don't fill Macquarie Street from Hyde Park down to Government House. You just couldn't move, and it was quite extraordinary. That's the crowd. Those are monarchists. Republicans could never do this. They tried on a number of occasions. Nobody ever bothered to come out. Our people came out when they thought it important. Guess who's there in the crowd? Tony. Yes. He was a stalwart, always with us.
Constitutional monarchists claim today's rally shows the people don't support the changes. State political reporter Kerry Douglas.
Thousands of people lined the route to the official residence this morning, bidding farewell to Admiral Peter Sinclair as he took his final trip down Government House Drive. Then they marched up Macquarie Street to make their protest outside Parliament House.
To protest about the unilateral and undemocratic interference with our rights by the Premier, Mr. Carr.
And the monarchists in the crowd were not prepared to tolerate Republicans. The opposition was keen to get in on the act. Leader Peter Collins maintaining the people must decide what happens to the governor.
This temporary madness by the Premier must stop. And it will. And it will. This is an issue that will not go away.
It's one of the largest crowds Macquarie Street has seen since the education rallies against the coalition government back in 1988. But this time the Labor Premier wasn't here to see it. After 2 weeks of controversy over his governor decision, Mr. Carr left on a trade mission to Vietnam last Saturday and won't be back until the weekend.
Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to send the strongest message you possibly can to Bob Carr in Hanoi. Stay in Hanoi, Bob. Hands off the go.
The acting Premier says people are just confused about the changes to the governor's role.
The reality is there's been no constitutional change in New South Wales. What we're doing is saying that the people of New South Wales who own Government House and who own the gardens around Government House now have better access to it.
But many in today's crowd used the occasion to send a message further afield. Australians for a constitutional monarchy maintain the New South Wales Premier's decision will affect the federal election campaign.
That's in fact what did happen. Paul Keating blamed, and he was on the record of doing this, blamed the loss of the 1996 election on this rally in Sydney and the reaction of people to throwing the governor out of Government House. Well, coming now to the Constitutional Convention. In 1998, as you know, They called a constitutional convention. John Howard called a constitutional convention. It was a postal vote. And I must admit, I'm very suspicious of postal votes because they're so easy to manipulate, even more easy than elections. And we got, monarchists combined, got about a third of the vote, a little over a third. The ARM got about a third, and importantly, independent Republicans got about a third. I think there was a lot of fraud, but also our people didn't think it was serious. They just thought it was a talk shop, and it wouldn't really matter that much. The crucial thing there is the independent Republicans, because they split. A number of them came our way. They didn't like the Turnbull-Keating model, so they were very useful in relation to the campaign. You might be interested in the monarchist vote. That's the third vote. ACM got 72% of the vote. Bruce Ruxton, he came to Lloyd Waddy, who was my predecessor. He wanted to come into ACM. Lloyd said, no, you'd be better campaigning separately. That was very true. It's good to have a number of different organisations. Where we slipped up, I think, was in relation to the preferences. We didn't do enough preference deals to make sure that we kept the monarchist vote within us. But Bruce Ruxton, as you see, just campaigning in Victoria, got 8.69%. Then the Monarchist League, Australian Monarchist League, campaigning with the Monarchist League of Australia, got a total of 8.7. That was mainly in Victoria, New South Wales and Tasmania. Then a very significant group, Queenslanders for Constitutional Monarchy, with Lady Bjelke-Petersen being the leading contender, and that was very popular. They were popular in Queensland. They brought a lot of votes our way. And finally, Fred Nile's Christian Democrats, the only political party to campaign to retain the monarchy. They got 4.81%. So, now, the Constitutional Convention was made up, and we must be aware of this because there may be another if they follow the Labor Party policy. The elected delegates were 76, and they're an equivalent number of non-elected delegates. The ARM got 26 delegates. 24 went to assorted Republicans, so they had 50 seats, 50 elected seats. There were 18 ACM, 3 Queenslanders for Constitutional Monarchy, 2 from Save the People, that was Bruce Ruxton's, 2 from the Monarchist League and the Monarchist League of Australia, and 1 from the Christian Democrats. And that made 26. So we looked as though we were outnumbered. Of the rest of the convention, 40 were ex officio, premiers, leaders of the opposition and the like. They were mainly Republicans, so we lost out on them. Very few. I think one premier was a constitutional monarchist, the Premier Richard Court of Western Australia. The Premier of this state started out as a monarchist and ended up a Republican. I think it was leader of the opposition. Yeah. Oh, he was good. And then there were 36 nominated delegates. Of the 36 nominated by the Howard government, only 10 turned out to be constitutional monarchists. There were people, prominent people like Cardinal Pell and Dr. Hollingworth, plus people who weren't represented. They pointed some Indigenous people and some young people. And I pointed this out to John Howard. I said, you've only given us 10 constitutional monarchists there. He said, oh, sometimes we make mistakes. But we were not outnumbered there, which wasn't very good. The point is, and I think you should always remember this when Republicans tell you that John Howard fixed it. That's how the Republicans say Howard fixed the convention, he fixed the question, and he fixed the number of people at the convention. Well, he didn't, quite obviously. He certainly didn't. What was wonderful about the monarchists, we came from 5 separate groups. The Republicans feared that we would bring up the McGarvey model. That was to have a committee of governors general, former governors general, and governors and chief justices to replace the Queen. This was referred to as the least worst model, and there were some people writing in the press as monarchists saying, bring that up because it'll be the easiest to defeat. And we could have used our numbers. There were sufficient numbers at the convention to do that. We didn't. We held a meeting. All of the groups met together, and we decided unanimously that we would not support the McGarvey model, our reason being we weren't there to support a republic, any republic, even the least worst republic. Also, we knew that the press would destroy us had we done that. Cardinal Pell, who moved the motion for the approval of the Turnbull model, praised us for our support of principle and for our unity, and he contrasted that with his own Republicans. The model, the Keating-Turnbull model, won a plurality. They were the biggest. They got the largest number of votes for any model, but they failed to win an absolute majority. Well, under the rules set out by the Howard government, if a model achieved a majority at the Constitutional Convention, then that was to be put to the people. Nothing about getting the most votes. So it looked as though there might not be a referendum because they failed to get an absolute majority, and they were very downcast. John Howard then came to the convention, and he announced that it would be silly not to put the preferred model to a referendum.
The only common sense interpretation of this convention is, firstly, that a majority of people have voted generically in favour of a republic, and secondly, that amongst the Republican models, the one that has just got 73 votes is clearly preferred. Now, when you bind those two together, it would be a travesty in common sense terms of Australian democracy for that proposition not to be put to the Australian people.
These are the Republicans cheering John Howard.
Republican.
Now they blame him for losing the referendum. You see what complete liars they can be in these matters. There's our friend with the Queen, and he caused a stir when he announced, Paul Keating was upset. Bob Carr went on television and said, the monarchists are winning the intellectual argument. Of course, he was absolutely right, but it was surprising that he actually said that. Now, we were able to argue, of course, that everything about our past supported the retention of the Crown. And that was that when Philip came to Australia, he brought the rule of law and constitutional government under the Crown. What he brought to Botany Bay, which was a penal colony, was not, as Malcolm Turnbull later said, a gulag. Turnbull said this is a British gulag at Botany Bay. Well, the first item there is the rule of law. The very first civil action brought in Australia was brought under the Charter of Justice before the civil court in New South Wales by two convicts. They claimed that a ship's captain had stolen goods from them, and they successfully got an order against the captain. Now, that doesn't happen in gulags. It doesn't happen in Nazi concentration camps. It happened in New South Wales. The very first case, you can go to the law reports and you see the first case brought by two convicts. And they brought the English language, our civil society, self-government, which came. It was already before the British Parliament, before the tax disturbance at Eureka. And, of course, we had federation. Just some of the things, I'm not praising myself, some of the things which established our intellectual arguments. We had the cane-toed republic, which caused a bit of amusement. The no-case papers, and there's a whole series of very splendid people there who prepared papers which were published setting out the arguments against change. And later on, Kerry published her book, and that's just a couple of other books came on. What we found during the campaign is how important it is to have good mottos, good advertising themes. But unlike so many of these in political campaigns, These weren't just empty things designed by an advertising agency. All of these were based on solid intellectual argument. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. This is the only republic in which it will be easier for the Prime Minister to sack the President than his driver, because the President could be sacked by the Prime Minister without notice, without grounds, and without any right of appeal. We wanted that to be included in the question. One that Alan Jones used all the time when people phoned up and said, "I don't know, Mr. Jones, what should I do?" He always said, regularly, if you don't know, vote no. If you don't know, vote no. And vote no to the politicians' republic. That was superb. I remember Kerry Jones being dragged to Parliament by some not very well-known constitutional monarchist MPs, and she had to appear. And they were complaining because she was denigrating politicians. And she had to explain this was a marvellous theme because it really appealed to people. They love the idea of voting no to the politicians' republic. And we've already got a republic, a crowned republic. This next one was on the flag. We had a portrait of a painting of the flag. When Republicans see this, they think of England. We monarchists think of Australia. Opinion polls, very important. A monarchist made a comment to Malcolm Mackerras. Malcolm Mackerras repeated this as a function. I remember asking him, would there be fraud in the referendum and would it be significant? This was before the referendum. He said, yes, there'll be fraud. He said it will be of some size. He couldn't say what size it would be. He said, but the result will be so clear that it won't matter. And he was shown to be right. This is a wonderful description of an opinion poll which somebody told Malcolm, but he can't remember who it was. An opinion poll consists of the answers of those willing to respond to uninvited questions put without notice on matters on which the respondents have not had the time to consider. Now, isn't that a good description of an opinion poll? What's important about opinion polls is the trend line. We must never get obsessed because one poll goes against us. It's the trend over time and across the polls. Always remember that support for change is invariably higher when the proposal is first announced, as we're seeing with the current plebiscite. As soon as there's an announcement of change, they haven't heard the other side. They think, oh, that's not a bad idea. But yes, I'll go for that. It's only when they hear the contrary arguments that it goes down. Just as the two-party preferred vote is crucial in election, they keep talking about who's the more popular as the leader, whether it's Turnbull or Shorten. The crucial thing is the two-party preferred vote. That tells you what's going to happen. The crucial statistic in an opinion poll on our republic issue is support for the republic, support for change, not support for the constitutional monarchy, because a lot of our people say they're undecided or they won't give their answers. It's how big is support for a republic. The newspapers will say, oh, there's not much support for the monarchy. That's rubbish. It's the size of the support for the change which is on the table. Now, this is crucial to us. And I saw it in Essential this year, the last 2 years rather. In one Essential poll, they asked, are you in favour of Australia becoming a republic? They were asking this all the time. And I think Peter Fitzsimons got to them because he commissioned his own poll. But he got to them to change it. Not are you in favour of a republic, are you in favour of a republic with an Australian as head of state? This is worth between 8 and 10 points. This is what we've really got to watch in the plebiscite. Why? We're not, I should imagine most of us couldn't care less about what the head of state is. The important thing for the constitutional monarchists is to rally behind the position that the Governor-General is the Australian head of state. No matter what our views are concerning the Queen. The Queen is sovereign. There's no mention of head of state in the Constitution. It's an international term used in diplomacy. It's very important that we push this point. And in the yes-no booklet in 1999, The Republicans mention it 9 times because it's so important. And I think we must be very wary of this. That's because they have no other argument for change. They used to have arguments for change. They used to say, oh, it'll improve trade, it'll increase immigration. Yes. There was even one by, I can't think of his name, he was the Minister for Immigration at one stage. He used to wear very bright clothes. Grasby, yes. Grasby said it would reduce unemployment. Reduce unemployment. Well, and the other thing is the Republicans have lost the youth vote, which Jai and I have been talking about, and there's this wonderful graph, and I'm a bit colourblind, but if you look at I'm told it's a yellow line. If you look at the yellow line, notice how support for Republic over the years from the referendum have been falling. That's, oops, I've done something wrong. See, that's a high point. That, curiously, support for Republic went up after the referendum.
Do you think that might be amongst young people a celebrity thing with William and Kate?
That's what the Republicans say. What I say in reply is that young people recognise that they're more than celebrities. They recognise that they are performing great services. And I think we see this with Harry today, with Invictus Games. I think young people, it would be very hard for them to sit and say exactly why, but I think the real reason is that they recognise, not only are they attractive young people, but they also have this sense of service which they like. They know they're not being taken for a ride. They're not after money from them. And look at this point. And thereafter, in the 2000, support among the young, but that other one is support among the total population. Notice how it goes down. Now, isn't that an attractive feature? I think that's one of the reasons why I'm very surprised that Shorten is even talking about it, but surely he knows this as well as we do. Our support base, and just now quickly talking about how we organise things, you've got 50,000 supporters. The important thing is to organise them into their electorates. And when Nick Hobson comes, he'll explain how the database will do this wonderfully, which had to be done manually back in 1999. But you've got to organise people into the electorate so that they can then be in the polling stations at those electorates. And you need a national campaign director. Who did we appoint as our national campaign director? That's David Elliott, now the Minister for Prisons and Counter-Terrorism in New South Wales. He was a soldier, he was an officer, and he was very good at organising this. And I'm delighted to say we have a new national campaign director who's sitting there in the front row, Nella Hall, who's going to be our national campaign director. With Parliament, you have to have ministers. We didn't have many ministers who were our side. There were 4, only 4. Some of them now have changed some of those old Howard ministers changed their minds afterwards. Then, of course, you have the MPs and the senators. Those are the ones who are willing to vote no. It is absolutely important in a referendum to have some people voting no. Otherwise, the yes-no booklet is not triggered. When, for example, they had the referendum on judges retiring earlier, there was no opposition. So there was no yes-no booklet, no argument against it. It's crucial to have that. When we had sufficient MPs and senators to vote against it, then the yes-no booklet has to be approved by them. They asked me to do the first draft, and I thought we should do this differently to the other ones. We should do it in 10 points. I like the idea of there being points. And we used up all of our allocation. The Republicans, advised by some very expensive advertising agents, said, oh no, have it short. The wonderful thing was, since they're printed on both sides of the yes-no booklet, you'd get to a certain page and then there'd be only us on the right-hand side, and nothing from the yes case on the left-hand side, except for a little note saying, the yes case finished at such and such a page, which suggests they didn't have many arguments. It was really wonderful. We didn't know that was going to happen, but it did happen. John Howard was impeccable. He, although a constitutional monarchist, he decided he should remain above the fray to an extent, as much as he could, and make sure that each side was treated fairly, which he did. The key ministers were Tony Abbott, Alexander Down, and Nick Minchin. Nick Minchin's coming tonight, by the way, not to the dinner, but to hear Tony Abbott. And they were very good. Nick Minchin was absolutely superb because he was the Minister for State, so that the convention was very much his responsibility. Yes, special Minister for State, yes. They set up a vote no committee with 7.5 million. They decided on how to appoint the members of the committee, and members of the committee were appointed on the basis of the number of votes you got for the convention election of those who opposed the model. And the result was that there were 10 seats, 8 went to ACM, and 2 went to independent Republicans, Clem Jones and Ted Mack. Clem Jones and Ted Mack proved to be very valuable allies because they campaigned against the Keating-Turnbull model. And they got money for advertising, which is very good, and money to do polling and independent research. What about allies? Well, of course, all the monarchist groups were allied together. We also had Republican allies, and we also had our no Republic branches. We decided you couldn't maintain a national organisation and have branches in different places and put them strictly under the control of ACM. You can't run people like that. That would be silly, but they would help us. And they were formed as autonomous branches. 2 are left at the moment. This is a cake at the Toowoomba anniversary, the 25th anniversary of ACM Toowoomba, which still has a local school competition, still going strong. And there is Delis Kelly. She's been to every ACM national conference except this one. She can't come for health reasons. There she is cutting the cake. Would you applaud her so I can tell her that that's what you do? She's an absolutely lovely lady. She met the Queen. I think she was running a guest house, wasn't she, where the Queen came to visit somewhere in the country. The structure, we had a company limited by guarantee, so you could maintain control. A national convener, who was Lloyd Waddy first, whom you saw on the screen outside Parliament House, and an executive director, and state and territory divisions. The executive directors we've had in that time up to the referendum, Kerry, and before her, Tony. So this is a rather complicated structure, but just very quickly, because it shows you what we might have to do soon, even in 2018. We had all of our supporters up there, an electorate coordinator in every electorate. The national campaign director, there's Nella, and an executive director, there's Jai, and the national convener, who's just the chairman, that's me. And over here we had the branches, autonomous branches, the allied groups, or other monarchist organisations, and even the Republicans. The only Republican organisation of any note was Clem Jones. He had a fortune. He'd been Lord Mayor of Brisbane. He was a very successful businessman, and he was very, very big in his campaign in Brisbane. Then we had the media, hostile to us, but in some ways captive to us because they couldn't avoid reporting a conflict. State and territory divisions and state and territory conveners and directors. We were able to raise sufficient money to have a full-time director in every state. It did help having someone in the office as well as ourselves. Then, of course, we have the yes-no booklet, the MPs and the ministers. And over here we had the Vote No Committee, had its own advertising budget, 7.5 million, and polling. chairman, who was Kerry, we had our own advertising. We managed to raise enough. Couldn't do any television advertising, but radio and some newspaper advertising. And there's the central command. We met every morning at 7 by telephone, and there was effectively an order of the day, that is, an agreement on what the key themes should be for that day. And that worked well, and I think it had a great effect in maintaining cohesion between the groups. And that's what we'll have to do next time. And now for the latest digital technology. I think we've got to wait for Nick. So I think now what we should do, this is constitutional monarchy throughout the world. And briefly, before I ask George Burgess to come up and say a few words about how monarchy is going in the world, the Human Development Index of the United Nations, but we won't hold that against them, measures life expectancy, education and income per head. The country obviously scores high. It has long life expectancy, good education and high income. The index was developed for member states of the United Nations. The interesting thing is, in 2017, and this wasn't an unusual year, the top 3 countries are Norway, Australia and Switzerland, 2 monarchies and 1 republic. Of the top 10 countries, 5 were constitutional monarchies. The top 20 countries, 10 were constitutional monarchies. But constitutional monarchies make up only 15% of all the countries. So we were greatly out of proportion. Constitutional monarchies perform better. They have much better records than republics. We should have only had 2 countries in the top 10 and 2 or 3 in the top 20.